I'd like to open up this talk by acknowledging that we are indigenous land, and that this land is Tewa, Tiwa, and Pueblo territory, and that this land is stolen. And I have participated in a history of colonial resettlement with my presence on this land for the last 25 years. And the humans that birthed me are refugees on this land, pushed from their homelands to claim another. This land is not their land. And I was given the first name of Hazel, and I was given the last name Batrezchavez. And I am the product of two humans, one born in Tampico, Mexico, the other born in San Marcos, El Salvador. And I choose to perform within a spectrum of genders that are neither masculine nor feminine. And according to the United States Census, I am ethnically categorized as Latina. And what you just heard is an excerpt from my poem In the Waiting Room. And throughout this talk, I'll be interweaving between discussing my art praxis and this poem that has come to influence the work that I'll be sharing with you all today. I recognize my work not only as an extension of myself, but as an ongoing conversation between myself and my own familiar history that honors and bears witness to the generational experiences of migration, isolation, and resistance. And this show in particular was conceptualized and titled after reading an essay by the Rax Media Collective titled Dreams and Disguises as Usual, where they introduced the notion of the waiting room as a physical space where people of color occupy until they are asked to perform their identity, an identity that is either projected or unknown to them. And this idea of the waiting room and seeing myself as existing within the waiting room came to influence a lot of my work these past 3 years in the form of questions. What does it mean to be silenced? What does it mean to enter and re-enter a space that you're not welcome in to begin with? And throughout this presentation, you will kind of see how it is that my praxis is really grounded in asking these open questions, and how for me it isn't necessarily about creating work that answers these questions, but rather it's about the process of creating a space where I can think about these questions in relationship to material or to my body and performance. So speaking of performances, this is one of the first performance pieces that I made, and it isn't a piece that I show often, but it's one of the earliest pieces in the history of my trajectory that I can pinpoint where it is that I was starting to think about what it meant to navigate life and be a person of color. And so in this 2-channel video that I shot in the fall of 2016 on Tungoba territory, what today is recognized as North Hollywood, California, follows 2 versions of a young woman moving through different spaces in 2 different neighborhoods divided by income. In one version, she's wearing this traditional folklorico dancing dress that was a replica of my mother's, as she was a traditional dancer. And then in this other version, she's wearing more modern clothing. And so when I was putting this piece together, I was a senior at Grinnell College in Meskwaki territory, what today is recognized as Iowa. And I was working on my senior thesis anthropology that had actually never gotten approved, but was about researching the language that higher educational institutions were using in their diversity initiatives to construct identity. And so really through the guidance of my mentor at the time, Dr. Katia Gibel-Mevarech, I was really able to start to see the connections between language, space, nationality, and power. And while I don't think that this performance piece reflected that conceptually, it really marked the starting point for a lot of the themes that I would continue to build on in graduate school the following year when I made this body of work. And I continued to explore performance in graduate school. And I made this performance piece that was shot in the fall of 2017 at the White Sands National Monument. And when I first went out there to film this piece, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing and what I wanted to do at the time, how I wanted this to kind of behave. But I felt so drawn to this site in particular because I felt that it really mirrored my experience of navigating through predominantly white institutions my entire life. And the feeling of my body being consumed and surrounded by whiteness in the White Sands National Monument really came to be what pushed me to do this performance in the first place, while I had no idea how I wanted to utilize it. And while I made many different iterations of this piece, one of the first ways that I presented it was projected onto a crate pallet that was commonly used for shipping and moving products. And I presented it alongside my grandmother's audio of her migration story of crossing the US border. And it was a piece for me that, when presented like this, really connected my grandmother's feelings of isolation, expressed in this recording of being the first in her family to migrate through the United States, juxtaposed with my own feelings of moving to New Mexico and being the first in my family to go to graduate school. And so this piece for me really functioned as kind of connecting our feelings of isolation across generations. And it was really, in this second iteration of the work, as I continued to build on thinking about isolation and landscape, and really after having done that Rax Media Collective reading, that I started to recognize this piece as kind of a visual translation of what the waiting room could kind of look like and feel like to me. And also throughout this time, I was taking classes with Dr. Kirsten Buick on American landscape, and I was really starting to make deeper connections between the relationship between the artist, landscape, and power, and learn the ways that race, class, and the body is constructed within space. And this knowledge really came to influence a lot of my work, because in particular with this piece, I was referencing my own body. So it really became a starting point to think about critically about my body and in the ways that I was presenting it. I was looking at a lot of artists like Ana Mendieta and Regina Galindo to kind of see what it is that they were doing and how they were putting meaning into context with this. Throughout the feedback that I got from this piece, I started to think more critically also about language, Spanish and English and translation, and also thinking about further what it meant to navigate through this space as a person of color and be silenced. And I started to think about this question in my next performance, where I continue to utilize my body. In this 2-channel video piece, I Don't See Colored, a white skin colored hand moves across my body and transcribes an identity onto me. And in the process of making this piece, I really wanted to make a connection between this phrase, I don't see color, and the word color in how it's been used historically, violently, as colored during segregation, but then also as this uplifting term, person of color. And I think throughout the process of making this piece, I kind of lost sight of what it is that I really wanted this piece to kind of do. And really almost anyone that I shared this piece with would comment on how passive it is that I looked in it. And so really, while I wanted folks to kind of bear witness and acknowledge the way that identity was being transcribed onto me, and the violence in this phrase, it really made me realize that a lot of the time our intention as an artist doesn't really matter. It's really about how does the work perform meaning into context. And so I really started to see myself in the role that I was playing in this piece as having no agency, and therefore this gesture that was being done onto me as kind of a violent one. And this really made me start to reflect and think more about this relationship that a person of color has with violence. As I continued in my creative research, I came across this image last summer of Oscar Alberto Martinez and his daughter Valeria, who drowned crossing the Rio Grande near Matamoros, Bronzeville, Texas. And this was the image that was actually circulated by the media. They didn't circulate they didn't circulate a photo of them alive or smiling. They chose to circulate this one of them floating in the river, their dead bodies floating. And so alongside this photo, I've included a photo series of a separate body of work, that I was thinking about the time of feminicide, where I too laid my body at the Rio and pretended to be dead or discarded, my intention being to reference feminicide. And so I know that a lot of us are aware of the way that the media presents people of color, but I think so often few of us are aware of the ways that art is also complicit of the violence in it as well. And I've noticed this trend and have participated in it as well, which is why I've included this photo for reference, that sometimes as artists of color and those who do performance with their own bodies, we often do violent things to ourselves to prove or to show the difficulties that we face. And often we think we're critiquing it, and sometimes we are. Don't get me wrong, but sometimes are we also just being complicit or replicating the same violence? The only difference being that we're doing it onto ourselves. And I think that this is honestly a really big problem for artists of color, because folks are so used to seeing us in relationship to violence that they then use the same words to describe us and our work. So what this piece really did for my praxis is that it really marked the beginning of starting to think critically of the way that I was utilizing my body in future performances. I really was able to recognize what it is that I wanted my work to be in critiquing these structures, but also in wanting my work to kind of reimagine a different future. And in particular, I was interested in a future where I was giving myself the agency that the world didn't want me to have. The only thing is that I didn't really know how to do that, and it was a little bit of a trial and error in the future performances to kind of figure out how best to do that. And it's definitely an ongoing conversation that I'm having with myself anytime I bring my body into the frame, to pause and to think more critically about how it is that these gestures are creating meaning. And in the waiting room, I am forced to bear witness to my plant relatives and how we have suffered from the same history, categorized and labeled migrant, invasive, alien, human, white, colored, exotic, Latina. And again I called out to the wind, is this what survival mode looks like? Because I'm tired of going through the motions. I wake up and wait for someone or something to call me out, to tell me who I am, what am I, who am I. And so really after making this piece, this performance piece, I Don't See Color, I had obviously done a lot of thinking about the way that my body was being presented and navigated in different spaces. And I wanted to keep thinking about this question about what it meant to be silenced and trying to reincorporate that into my praxis. And for me, I really just kept thinking about how I felt heavy, how being silenced felt heavy. And I started to explore that a little bit more with material. And I turned to cement particularly because it directly correlated with that feeling of heaviness. And I made this self-portrait that it's composed of 10 blocks that are kind of precariously stacked on top of each other. And they're embedded with corn husk, my own hair, beans, rice, the American flag, and copies of my passport. And I embedded those materials inside of the cement blocks because they were materials that contributed to these feelings of heaviness that was coming from the way that I was navigating through spaces. And it was really important for me in the process of making this piece to not make it perfect, to not make a pillar that was perfectly stacked on top of each other, but rather one that was imbalanced, that really kind of spoke to the ways that I wasn't going to conform to the white gallery space that I was going to be interacting with. And so kind of grounded in that motivation, I decided to make my own flag because I really wanted to make a gesture that reflected these feelings of not only feeling heavy, but of trying to take up space and to really try and find a way where I can create agency for myself. And this particular way was actually one that felt really familiar to me because as an undergraduate, I had organized protests with other students for the Black Lives Matter movement and had actually traveled in 2016 to North Dakota to camp at the Osheti-Sequoian, where we protested the pipeline. And not only was that the first time that I was introduced to indigenous resistance theory, but it was also a time where I was starting to lead sewing circles and screen printing workshops, where we would make our own banners to take to these protests. So it was really a skill set that I think I kind of turned to subconsciously as a place that was familiar to create agency. And I think this was really the first piece where I was starting to intentionally make a relationship between my experience as a community organizer and the theories that are involved in that. Liberation theories, liberation movements, and to really start to think about how it is that could coexist with my work and the intentions that I wanted with my work at this time to be. And so literally within the next week of having documented that piece, I traveled to Mexico City for an artist residency. And residencies, I think, are such a privilege because a lot of organizations in other countries center their residencies around tourism, which can be problematic. But in particular, what I really loved about SOMA was that, we were really able to engage in a lot of critical conversation and to visit, more of independent run galleries. And I applied to this program because I really wanted to put myself in an environment where I could challenge myself to think critically about identity politics, but in a way that was different from the framework in the United States. And it's something that I actually like to encourage my advanced students to do a lot, and to just kind of be a risk taker and to apply for things. Because you never really know what you're going to get. And that's kind of how I had felt with this experience at SOMA, that I had just applied to it and, was really lucky that I had gotten this opportunity. And so while I was in Mexico, I continued to think about these themes that I was working with in language and in space, but now in just navigating through life in La Ciudad de Mexico. And so I was inspired to really make this piece, Negrita, because I was on the metro one day and I was thinking, and this person kind of came by with a boombox with playing this song called Negrita Sandia by Cricri.
Negrito Sandia, o te acoso con tu tía.
And it was a song that I had actually heard growing up, so it was kind of this taking back moment to where my grandmother used to sing this specific lyric to me, Negrita Sandia, ya no digas tonterías. And it's a lyric that translates as, Black girl, don't tell any more foolish things. And she really liked to sing this song to me because of my dark complexion in comparison to my four sisters. So this piece, I started to look more into the phrases that utilize the word negrita for feminine and negrito for masculine, and trying to think about, how is it that we can create a space where one can be empowered within them. And so I made this piece with the intention that when you connect the red letters, the phrases together reveal a hidden message. So it says, yell, you're made of gold. Yell, don't let yourself be taken advantage of. And yell, you are the moon. And so after I came back from Mexico, I started the semester again, and I continued to work with a lot of material experience and did a lot of collaging. And collaging for me is really an exercise that I like to engage with a lot in my practice because I think it's made of a lot of intuitive gestures. And for me, it really helps me create a space where layers of things that I'm thinking about in relationship to migration, isolation, and language can really collide and exist with each other. And so the collages that I was making at this time after I came back from Mexico really came to influence this piece that's now in this show, where I kind of took that same imagery in those initial collages and repurposed them in this kind of larger version. And so after the end of that semester, I traveled back to Mexico in January for a 3-week residency in art and ecology in Guapamacatoro in Michoacan, Mexico. And this residency was a little bit different than Soma because not only were we not in the city, but it was a lot more making oriented rather than critical theory discussion oriented than Soma. And I had initially applied to this residency to really just work on my writing at the time. But during the 3-hour drive from Mexico City to Michoacan, I witnessed a lot of crop fields burning, and farmers utilized the slash and burning technique in the field to burn down old crops and make room for new growth. And so really after arriving at the residency, the owner mentioned that they were going to do a crop burn the following week. So I proposed to do a performance where I would stencil the shape of the United States in water on the field and stand inside it while the rest of the field burned, as a way to reference isolation, as being feelings of being silenced and trapped within the United States. And so the planning process for this, it was at the time one of the biggest performances that I had done. And it took a lot of planning, actually. I worked with a rancher who helped me water down the field. But also it was very taxing because in the rural parts of Mexico, water is not something that's accessible, and it's a really big commodity. So you actually get water delivered to you once a week, and we had to plan this performance on the day that water was being delivered, because if we didn't, then we would use up all the water for the week. And it was a performance that I felt it was kind of like a now or never kind of thing, because it was really only the one time that I would be able to have access to be able to do a performance like this, where I didn't really have a lot of restrictions that you would otherwise have in the United States. And so after I came back from this residency, I really couldn't stop thinking about the process of making that performance and the commodification of water and of gasoline. While I was in Michoacan, there also happened to be a huge gas shortage. And I found a lot of insight after I came back in reading this book by Leanne Bitta Simpson. It's called As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance. And I thought I'd just share this quote with you. Extraction and assimilation go together. Colonialism and capitalism are based on extracting and assimilating. My land is seen as a resource. My relatives in the plant and animal worlds are seen as resources. My culture and knowledge is a resource. My body and children are resources because they are the potential to grow, maintain, and uphold the extraction-assimilation system. The act of extraction removes all of the relationships that gives whatever is being extracted meaning. Extracting is taking. Actually, extracting is stealing, and it is taking without consent, without thought, or even knowledge of the impacts that extraction has on other living things in the environment. And that's always been a part of colonialism and conquest. Colonialism has always extracted the indigenous, extraction of indigenous knowledge, indigenous women, and indigenous people. In this quote, and really this book, and amongst others, didn't just influence my praxis, but it really started to shift my thinking moving forward, because it really gave me insight on ways to work together on how to work together with other communities and building a relationship that's centered around reciprocity, humility, respect, and gratitude, which is something that I really benefited from, because shortly after I was awarded with this 9-month Story Maps Fellowship at the Santa Fe Art Institute, where I was partnered with the Santa Fe Dreamers Project, a nonprofit that worked with individuals seeking asylum, work permits, DACA, citizenship, status, etc. They really helped with anything. And it was really from this opportunity, and really just like the opportunities leading up to this, that the idea of the waiting room really started to expand a little bit. I spent the next 3 months following lawyers, hearing court testimonies, visiting the Cibola Detention Center, and driving down to El Paso to visit their offices. And, you know, I started to interact with the border in a way that wasn't just symbolic. And the next couple of months from this fellowship really revolved around bearing witness to everything that was happening at the border. And at the time, you know, things were not good. They're still not good. Because on that day, February 15th, 2019, Trump declared a state of emergency in El Paso, Texas. And the blood that was running there kept running. And the woman didn't know what to do. The land that was her body was drying up. And the animals that made up her spirit were dying of thirst. And so she separated the corn into 3 piles: good, bad, for the goat. And with each pass that she made to degrain it, she remembered the foreign hands that drew lines. Lines that marked where the petroleum was. Lines that marked the fields of cacao and coffee. Lines that declared human and non-human. Lines that divided. Lines that conquered. Lines that manipulated. Lines that imprisoned. And so around this time, I had actually also started organizing with the Red Nation and participating in a couple of direct actions in El Paso, Texas, where I was detained and eventually served with the warrant on this day. And so seeing myself projected in this manner by the El Paso Police Department created not only a deeper relationship to my work, as I was, you know, physically being called out of, you know, this waiting room and asked to kind of, you know, present myself to authorities, but it also made me kind of go through this process of acknowledging that a lot of folks that actually cross the border are subject to going through our criminal system. And so my case isn't technically resolved, so I won't actually talk about it more, but I bring it up because I think these 2 experiences really sort of marked a breaking point in my art practice. Because not only was I being called out of the waiting room, you know, and not only was I also bearing witness to all these stories of folks that were crossing borders and the criminalization process that they were going through and the abuse that they were facing by authority, you know, it all led me to reflect on the question, what does survival mode look like? You know, what does survival mode look like in our current cultural landscape, you know, for someone who's crossing borders, for someone who has skin color, for someone who's in the waiting room? And from the reflecting on that question, I started the Keep Going project. And this is a project that's been ongoing, but it functioned as a way for me to open up my art praxis at this time. I would embroider the word keep going onto fabric or cloth, and I would really just focus on that task and on that mantra for myself. And afterwards, I would give these, you know, these little pieces to several folks kind of as an act of reciprocity. I gave it to some of the lawyers and the staff at the Santa Fe Dreamers, to women who were recently released from detention, and also just to artists and other folks that were just kind of coming by my studio at the time. And maybe it's something that I should keep kind of a record of, but for me it feels really invigorating and exciting to kind of see the ways that this phrase and this piece has really come to exist in other folks' practice and other folks' daily lives. Around this time that I was kind of kicking off on this project, I actually received news that my grandfather was about to pass away. So I pretty much just dropped everything that I was doing here in New Mexico and just drove cross country in 2 days, really just to see him one more time. And the end of his life and the death and the process of mourning really came to bring the poem together as he took on the voice of the wind in it. No llores por mí, don't cry for me. Tú eres parte de mí, you are part of me. Sangre de mi sangre, blood of my blood. Hueso de mi hueso, bone of my bone. Para mí tú eres un tesoro. For me you are a treasure. And these were actually the last words that he shared with me before he passed away. And this piece in particular, To Have Mourned You, was created in that state of mourning. Afterwards, I continued to work on trying to create intentional space for him in my studio. Throughout this time, I bared witness to a lot of stories of violence at the border. In the mourning that I was going through with my grandfather, and in trying to create an intentional space for him, led to this altar. And it also led to help me process also all of the violence and the stories of the folks that I was listening to, and to really try and create a space for intentional thinking and acknowledging. And so on March 13th, 2019, when Congress failed to veto that state of emergency, I called out to the wind, and I asked them to hear my prayer. Give me strength and courage to confront my enemy, for we are too late for Roxana Hernandez, for Jacqueline Cow, for Tamir Rice, for Marie Juarez, for Philandro Castile, for Wilmore Josue, for Freddie Gray, and for the 1,000 others that have died in our arms. And I don't know where to point fingers. Who has hurt me more, them or my own people? So I ask that you light one for us both. Because in the waiting room, I am authenticated, put into existence in my own field of freedom, where I know these truths to be self-evident: alienation, naturalization, citizenship. In the front lines, we are incarcerated, in freezers, under freeways, in private prisons, with monitors on our ankles, and in temporary tent cities where families are separated and children have and continue to die. And my body was at the crossing once, and it was tall like the leaves of the flor de isote. And this need to create a space for intentional thinking and acknowledgement is what inspired this next project that is grounded in reciprocity. I really wanted to give back to the community because not only were they giving me these stories to reflect on and to listen to, but they also didn't really know that I was listening to their stories, and I didn't want to create a project that was exploiting these stories in some kind of way, but really wanted to create something that I could find a way to give back to the community. So I kind of came up with this idea of subverting the role of the paletero. And for those of you that don't really know or are familiar with the paletero, it's typically a male street vendor that sells paletas, ice cream bars, candy, and they're pretty well known for bringing the community together with their popular bell jingle. And so I created this paleta cart, La Luchadora, that would give out free paletas and also discreetly give out Know Your Right information that was printed on the napkins. And And so while there was great resources for organizations regarding know your rights informations, a lot of folks in the undocumented community are don't really have access to this information, and most of the times like feel intimidated to ask for it as well. So for me, this project was really important because it made a way for this information to kind of be approachable and familiar to folks. I partnered with the Paleteria Oasis in Santa Fe, a family-run business that made these paletas, and with the Pueblo Unido organization, and also in Santa Fe to get the Know Your Rights information. I then took this piece and performed it at the Port of Entry in El Paso, Texas, with the help of the Santa Fe Dreamers Project. And it was really meaningful because I think a lot of folks, I could physically see folks taking these napkins and kind of folding them delicately and putting them in their pockets to kind of save for later. And I think it was a piece that, felt really rewarding in that kind of way. And it's a project that I hope to continue this following year, and really hope to kind of continue this process in trying to subvert roles of authority and really try to imagine a space of agency. And right now, it's a part of the process, but I feel so full of gratitude and lucky to have been able to make this body of work and collaborate with folks and grow along in this process. So this idea of the waiting room and seeing myself as existing within the waiting room wasn't an easy concept to tackle, and it's really layered and built upon the way that I navigate myself in our current culture history over the past 3 years. And throughout this process, I've tried to find ways to honor and bear witness to not only my family's history, but to those who've had similar experiences. And it's been such a privilege to be able to do that, and to be able to have the support from my mentors, Suhan Ho, Mary Songas, Kirsten Buick, and Kenzie Conejo, who've always really encouraged me in this process to have faith in myself. And ultimately, at the end, to be an artist is a privilege, and I just feel so lucky to be in this position and to be sharing my work with you all.